Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Videntis podcast. It's January 16th, 2025. We have got a lot to unpack today, so let's dive right in.
Sounds good.
We've got some really interesting stories making headlines today. Former presidents are avoiding events hosted by former President Trump. We're going to revisit the legacy of the consumer advocate Ralph Nader, and we'll be examining the nomination of Doug Burgum as the new Secretary of the Interior.
Yeah, you know what's really interesting to me is how these stories, while they seem kind of separate at first glance, they actually all tap into this bigger conversation about where our country's at right now. We're talking political polarization, individual activism, and even how we manage public resources.
You're right, and that's exactly what we're going to do today.
Yeah.
Break it all down, help you connect the dots, and understand what it all means. So let's jump right in with this whole political drama. Former Presidents Obama, Clinton, and Bush have all decided to skip any events hosted by former President Trump.
Yeah, and that's a pretty significant move. I think it really highlights the deep political divisions in the U.S. You know, a recent poll showed that 60% of Americans believe the country is more divided now than it was during Obama's presidency.
60%.
Oh.
That's a huge number.
Yeah.
It really shows how fractured things have become.
It's not just about having different opinions anymore. This level of division can have some serious real-world consequences.
Exactly. It erodes trust in our institutions. It fuels extremism.
Yeah.
And it makes it so much harder to solve problems together.
Absolutely.
It's like we're living in two different realities.
Right. And social media seems to be playing a big role in all this.
Yeah. And it's interesting because former President Obama, the one who was so successful using social media in 2008, he's now warning us about how easily it can be manipulated.
Yeah.
And how it spreads misinformation.
Yeah, he's pointed out that social media's vulnerability to manipulation is actually making it harder to have meaningful conversation.
It makes you wonder, if someone like Obama, who really mastered social media, is concerned about its downsides, what does that mean for the rest of us? How do we even navigate this new information landscape where the truth is constantly being challenged?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think it starts with being more aware of our own biases, seeking out diverse perspectives, and just being more critical of what we see online.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Ralph Nader. This guy is a legend, fighting for consumer rights for over 5 decades.
Nader's impact is huge. His book, Unsafe at Any Speed, back in 1965. That was a game changer.
Oh yeah, I remember learning about that in school.
It exposed the dangerous designs of some American cars, and it led to a ton of safety regulations that we just take for granted now, like seatbelts and airbags.
It's crazy to think that something like seatbelts used to be such a big fight.
Right. But Nader didn't stop there. He went on to tackle environmental protection, corporate accountability, always fighting for the little guy.
I read that he even had a team of volunteer law students. They were called Nader's Raiders. They helped him investigate corporate wrongdoing.
It's inspiring, right? One person's passion can really spark a movement, and Nader's organization, Public Citizen, is still fighting the good fight today.
They're working on safe products,
Yeah.
clean air and water, a more transparent government.
Exactly. And at a time when trust in institutions is so low, Nader's story reminds us that we all have the power to make a difference.
Absolutely. Okay, so last story for this segment. Doug Burgum, the former governor of North Dakota, has been nominated by President-elect Trump to be the next Secretary of the Interior.
And this is a big deal. The Interior Department manages 500 million acres of public land, employs over 60,000 people.
Wow, that's a lot of responsibility.
It is. And to add to that, Burgum will also chair the newly formed National Energy Council.
Interesting.
Seems like a pretty clear sign that the new administration is prioritizing energy production.
So can you tell us a little more about this National Energy Council? What is it exactly?
Well, it's this new body that will be responsible for coordinating energy policy, making sure everything is running smoothly across different agencies.
So how is this nomination being received?
It's a mixed bag. Some tribal leaders have expressed concerns about Burgum prioritizing profits over the protection of public lands and sacred sites.
Yeah, that's understandable given the history there.
Right. But there are also those who worked with Burgum in North Dakota, and they highlight his willingness to engage with tribal communities and his efforts to improve communication and cooperation.
Sounds like a complex situation with no easy answers.
Definitely. It'll be interesting to see how Burgum handles all these different interests.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first segment. From political polarization to Ralph Nader's legacy and now this big nomination. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll delve a little deeper into these stories and explore their connections in more detail. Stay tuned.
Looking forward to it.
We were just talking about Ralph Nader and his incredible dedication to fighting for consumer rights. It's amazing how his story connects to this broader theme of accountability that keeps coming up. He really showed how one person can push for transparency and change, even when going up against really powerful institutions.
You know what's so fascinating about Nader? He didn't just complain or point fingers. He actually offered solutions. He got people involved and forced those in power to actually listen.
Yeah, he didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk.
Exactly. And his strategies, like using those raiders to dig up dirt and expose those bad practices, they're still relevant today, even in this digital age.
You think so? How?
Well, think about it. Those methods could be used for current consumer protection issues, things like data privacy or the influence of those massive tech companies.
That's an interesting point. I like it. It really makes you think about how those strategies could be updated for the world we live in now. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the deep political divides we're facing, the power of individuals to spark change, and the absolute need for accountability. Now, let's talk about Doug Burgum, the former governor of North Dakota, who's been nominated to be the next Secretary of the Interior.
Oh, yeah, this is a big one. We're talking about the department in charge of 500 million acres of public land. They oversee something like 60,000 employees.
Wow, that's a massive job.
It is a massive responsibility. And to make things even more interesting, Burgum will also be leading the newly formed National Energy Council.
What, so he's going to be super busy.
It looks like it, and this new council, it's tasked with making sure all energy policy is on the same page across the different government agencies, which seems to say that energy production is going to be a big focus for this administration.
I see. So for those of us who aren't energy policy experts, can you break down what this National Energy Council is and why it matters so much?
Sure. Think of it as like a central command center for everything energy related. It's supposed to streamline decision-making and how those policies actually get put into practice. But it does make you wonder what their priorities will be. Will they be focused on boosting the traditional energy sources, or will things like renewable energy get equal attention? And how will environmental concerns be factored in with this push for increased energy production?
Sounds like Burgum is going to be walking a tightrope. So what are people saying? What do they think about his ability to do this job?
Well, opinions are mixed, as you can imagine. Some tribal leaders, for example, have voiced some serious concerns about Burgum's nomination. They're worried that he might prioritize profits over things like protecting public lands and those sacred sites, which are incredibly important to their communities.
Yeah, given the history there, those concerns are definitely understandable. Are there any groups who are more optimistic about his appointment?
There are some tribal leaders who actually worked with Burgum during his time as governor in North Dakota have said that he is willing to engage with tribal communities, that he really made an effort to build trust and find ways to cooperate. So they see this appointment as a chance to keep making progress on tribal sovereignty and self-determination.
It sounds like Burgum's nomination is a bit of a mirror, reflecting back the different hopes and fears people have. It will be really interesting to see how he navigates all these different interests and what his time in this role means for the future of energy, the environment, and the government's relationship with Native American tribes. So for you, what stands out the most about Burgum's nomination?
You know what's interesting to me? It's how all of these stories we've been discussing today, while they might seem different on the surface, they all come back to this one question. How do we as a nation, as a society, deal with power? Who has it? How do they use it? Who benefits from it? It doesn't matter if we're talking about political polarization, advocating for consumers, or figuring out how to manage our natural resources. It all comes back to this idea of accountability.
That's a really insightful observation, and it reminds me of what we were talking about with Ralph Nader. His story teaches us that we don't just have to sit back and hope things get better. We have the power to demand better from our leaders, to hold institutions accountable, and to fight for the changes we want to see.
You got it. And that's where I think Nader's legacy is so important. He showed us that even when things seem impossible, when we're up against these huge challenges, when citizens come together, when they demand transparency and refuse to accept the way things are, real change is possible.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive here on the Videntis podcast.
It's been quite a journey today.
It has. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We have. From those political divides, Ralph Nader's incredible legacy, and Doug Burgum's nomination as the new Secretary of the Interior.
You know, it's fascinating how all of these stories, as different as they might seem, they all touch on this really important idea of power. Who has it? How they use it? And who benefits from it in the end.
Absolutely. It's about those dynamics of power and how we as individuals and as a society hold each other accountable.
Right. And as we look back on everything we've discussed, I can't help but wonder, where do we go from here? What happens next?
It's hard to say for sure, but if we look at the trends we've been talking about, we can make some educated guesses.
Okay, like what?
Well, if this political polarization keeps getting worse, it could really paralyze the government.
You mean make it harder to get anything done?
Exactly. It'll be almost impossible to tackle those big challenges we're facing, like climate change,
Yeah.
economic inequality, and healthcare.
That's a pretty grim outlook.
It is, but it's a real possibility.
So what can we do? How do we prevent that from happening?
Well, that's where I think Ralph Nader's story is so inspiring.
How so?
He showed us that we don't have to be passive. We have the power to demand more from our leaders.
To make them listen to us.
Exactly. We can hold institutions accountable and fight for the changes we want to see.
It all comes back to that idea of individual action, of not just sitting back and hoping for the best.
Right. We have to be active participants in shaping our future.
And that brings us to Doug Burgum. His appointment as Secretary of the Interior. It's a perfect example of this. He's going to be under a lot of scrutiny. People are going to be watching his every move.
They are, especially those who are passionate about protecting the environment, tribal sovereignty, and finding that balance between energy production and conservation.
It's a tough job.
It is, and his decisions are going to have a huge impact.
It feels like we've come full circle. Back to that question of accountability. How do we ensure that those in power are making decisions that benefit everyone?
It's a question that we need to keep asking,
Yeah.
and we need to keep demanding answers.
So as we wrap up our deep dive today, I want to leave you with this thought. These stories we've talked about, they're not just headlines. They're part of a much bigger story, the story of our nation.
And we're all writing it together.
Exactly. And it's up to each of us to make sure that it's a story of progress, of justice, and of a better future for everyone. Thanks for listening to the Videntis podcast.
It's been a pleasure.